Hey, what's going on? I'm Travis with Proselytize or Apostatize, and I'm really stoked for tonight's conversation. I'm here with my really good friend Seth. Seth Hart is a PhD student in science and theology at the University of Durham. He holds a master's in theology from Oxford Regent College and Johnson University. His current research delves into whether the field of biology and its fundamental concepts are built upon theistic foundations, as well as a contributor and writer of articles for Capturing Christianity. So, Seth, welcome. Go ahead and introduce yourself. Tell us what you're working on, things like that.
Yeah, yeah, it's great to be here, Travis. Yeah, one quick clarification. So there actually is an Oxford Regent College, a Regent
Mhm.
College, Oxford. So I have a degree from the University of Oxford and from Regent College.
I was wondering
So
about that. Okay.
yeah. Just in case, so no one gets confused out there. No, so one from Oxford and another one from Regent College in Vancouver. Yeah, so my
Gotcha.
current work, so I'm working in biology and teleology. Now, there's
Right.
been a lot of work in that done from different angles. And when most people
Mhm.
hear the term, they normally associate that with either intelligent design or
Mhm.
people who have a more hierarchical overview. Maybe the evolutionary process itself is teleological, such as what Rope has been doing, who's been on Cambridge Channel, or what Simon Conway Morris at Cambridge has been doing. And I've written articles on him. My project's a bit different. What I'm asking is whether or not life forms themselves are teleological, so that teleology itself just becomes inescapable as soon as you have a field of biology. And then, if that's
Mhm.
true, what sort of implications does that have for an atheistic, mechanistic, materialistic sort of paradigm which pervades the
Mhm.
scientific community and pervades the sort of
Mhm.
interpretation of of the natural world that we have?
Yeah, absolutely. And before we get started, what got you interested in this particular field of study?
Yeah, it's a great story. So I actually started out as a biology major.
Okay.
Yeah, I went to a state university. Was Really was enjoying it, but I also decided to wanted to take a couple classes in theology. And sooner
Mhm.
rather than later, I came to discover that theology was where my main interest would lie, and that biology would sort of always be there, present, but always sort of sitting in the background.
All
So
right.
I've never sort of given up on that biological side of theology. So it kind of grew as a natural outgrowth of wanting to integrate these two fields. So lo and behold, I happened to get interested in this right whenever the burgeoning field of science and theology, science and religion was taking off. So now there's seats at chairs at Cambridge, Oxford, Princeton, quite a few universities. They're popping up all over. It's really probably the fastest growing field in theology would be science and theology. So it's a good time to
Yeah.
get interested in that topic. But
Yeah.
the topic itself, where I really decided to peg and narrow in on for this dissertation,
Mhm.
this project that I'm working on, was partially inspired by a book I think you're currently reading. Uh,
Oh, No God, No Science, Michael
no,
Hamby.
no God, no science. It was recommended to me, and I remember picking up that book and thinking, "This is the most awful title I think I've ever
Right.
read for a theology book." Um,
Yeah.
which be words I'd soon regret, because the book itself is probably one of the top 10 books I've read.
Right.
In the Yeah, absolute mind blowing book, and
Yeah, I'm really liking how it really emphasizes that metaphysics undergirds the scientific process and everything. And while they're distinct, that science is distinct, you can't escape the underlining metaphysics in it.
yeah, and this has actually been a big criticism of the field of science and theology writ
Mhm.
large, has been that, well, let's put these two fields into dialogue with one another. Well, more
Yeah.
often than not, one side's doing all the talking, the other side's doing all the note taking and revising its
Right.
views, and that's theology, right? How can we get
Mhm.
theology to align with science? What Hansby's book was one of the first things I've seen is theology talking back, and not in a
Hmm.
critical way, but in a productive way of showing science that it's not theologically or philosophically neutral, nor has it ever been. And
Sure.
I think that's the future. Not only just for theology and science, I think for apologetics as well. I think that's a really untapped field.
Yeah, I totally agree. See, I kind of came into the faith this way. Like, I grew up like not really believing in God, and it was things like the contingency and the teleology. A lot of people call fine tuning that kind of piqued my interest. Especially like what's known as the local fine tuning, like the precision in like the ice age cycles, the level of plate tectonics, volcanism, and all of these conditions that are right for advanced life to survive and thrive. So I've always had a passion for that as well.
Yeah, I think what's really nice about that is, and Hanby's book will touch on this, is we've been conditioned to think very numerically and quantitatively. There's nothing wrong with that, but it is something that is a sort of product of the modern scientific imagination.
Right.
So whenever we can start putting numbers to things and showing quantitative measures that seem to suggest some sort of design, some sort of working intelligence, that speaks to us a lot more, and I think it's more apologetically effective for the modern mindset. My argument is qualitative; it's not quantitative. So it's got a weakness in that respect, but I think it's got a fundamentality to it. The fact that biology itself couldn't exist without teleology. That's essentially the point I'm making. That is more of a strength. So they just sort of. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, go ahead, please.
I was going to say they just sit sort of complementary to each other, and I've talked with people like Rope and Simon Conway Morris who see this as two competing teleological arguments, teleological trajectories that can sort of sit hand in hand and sort of undergird a greater apologetic case.
So, is there a particular finding of evolutionary biology that you cling to more, like neo-Darwinianism, process structuralism? With the various views in the extended evolutionary synthesis, is there one that you kind of gravitate towards more than others? Or
yeah, I think the EES, the extended evolutionary synthesis, is right. And this is just speaking with most of the younger biologists that I know and have been in dialogue with, is that this does seem like the future of evolutionary science. Now, what I will say is my project really sort of looks at Darwinian evolution.
Okay.
And most people within the EES will tell you that the EES is extending the synthesis. It's not doing away with the neo-Darwinian synthesis. That's obviously by the name, right? Yeah. So in a sense, Darwinism as a sort of primary, if not, the primary mechanism of evolutionary change, that might be a product of the past. And I hate to say that because so much of my project, I'm undermining my own project. There's so much of my project actually looks at Darwinian evolution itself. So, but as long as it's even a mechanism, I think the argument works.
Yeah, that's awesome. So speaking of that, let's go ahead and kind of get into the meat of this. So can you give us a brief summary or overview of what your teleological argument is?
Yeah, so let's begin. I got to go all the way back to Aristotle, unfortunately.
Let's go, brother.
And Aristotle, of course, had four causes, right? We had the efficient cause, the thing doing it, right? So if it's Michelangelo's David, that's Michelangelo. You have the material cause, the thing that it's made out of. So it would be the material that the sculpture is made from. You have the formal cause, which would be David. It's a person. When you look at that, you're supposed to see a person. That's the form attached to it. And of course, there's a final cause, the purpose for which it was made. When Michelangelo made it, he had a purpose in mind. It's what moved him to create it, whether it was to look beautiful for a church. I actually don't, unfortunately, know the history of it, but I can pretty well assert that it wasn't that he had a purpose in doing so, right? That's also part of the explanation for why Michelangelo's David exists. And you need all four. And that final cause is often used interchangeably with teleology, right? So that's what I'm looking at. Well, we get into the modern world and with modern science and with people like Bacon and Descartes, they really sort of wanted to do away with final causation and formal causation, final causation especially. And this actually came not from scientific concerns, but from theological concerns. And I can get into that. But long story short, what ended up happening was final and formal causation were sort of done away with in science. And efficient material causation became, especially efficient causation, became the sort of backbone of the scientific enterprise. So when I ask, even today, when I say what caused something, normally what I mean is the efficient cause. I don't mean what the final cause or the formal cause, right? Sure. So if I looked at Michelangelo's David and said, what's the cause of this? It makes sense if I said, well, it's Michelangelo carving it. It wouldn't make sense to say the person of David or David, that you might give me a funny look if I said that. That's shaped our modern imagination. And of course, that infiltrated science in, say, astronomy or physics or chemistry. You don't ask, what is a molecule for?
Right.
You don't ask what a planet is for. I wonder what that planet's there for, what its purpose is. But scientists, if they discover, say, a stegosaurus, and they see its tail spikes, one of the first questions they ask is, what's it there for? That's perfectly appropriate. So biology has clung on to teleology. It's clung on to final causes, using this idea of what is it there for. Aristotle's not fully dead. He exists still very prominently within the biological field. And so the question then becomes, if we do believe in a materialistic, atheistic universe, one that's purely mechanistic, efficient causes only, there is no sort of grander purpose. Purposes are sort of alien because they're products of minds. Minds give purposes. How do we account for this? You can't say that the Stegosaurus itself gave itself that purpose. And so that's the question. It's the problem of teleology. And then for the past few decades, it has been the most well-discussed topic in the philosophy of biology is how do we deal with this fact that biology itself doesn't even seem to make sense outside of this. There's one great quote that I love to use, which is nothing in biology makes, it's not evolution that nothing in biology can make sense without. It's teleology. And
yeah, I like that. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's not from a Christian source. It's literally just getting to the fact that what makes a thing seem to be alive is the fact that it has purposes. That seems to be why we mentally think of something as alive. It has some sort of purpose or goals or orientation, we might say.
Right. That's what I was thinking. You see, not just in intelligence, but in intentionality and aboutness.
Right. Exactly. And that becomes quite difficult to maintain. So the materialist atheistic perspectives have tried many different ways to get around this. For instance, they've said, well, perhaps it's just a product of evolution. So that's usually the favorite thing to appeal to is, well, if so, for instance, the tail spikes on a Stegosaurus, well, it helped it defend itself in the past. And so whenever we say, well, this is what it's for, all we're talking about is this sort of propensity for it to survive or how it has in the past helped the creature to survive. And that's usually an attempt to sort of hand wave it off and try to say, that's what we mean. That's what we mean when we talk about purposes in biology. There's nothing more to it than just an evolutionary history or, the sort of backward looking perspective, or occasionally they'll have a forward looking, or if it would perhaps in the future, then that's going to be the purpose, some sort of survival advantage. So, and that's been the sort of attempt to get around that. It's known as the etiological perspective. And I've written a little on the article we talked about of it.
Right, which I recommend everyone check out. That's actually available on Capturing Christianity.
Yeah.
All right. So yeah, I was gonna kind of ask you, what some pushback is you get. I'd like to kind of get into our, because you have people like Draper who make arguments from evolution like being more compatible with indifference. But before we get into the philosophical objections, are there any like other scientific objections, objections you would run into from the scientific community?
Those would be the major ones. We can get into, there's been dozens of other proposals. The ones that have gotten, the one I should say that has gotten the biggest adherence has been the etiological perspective. That idea that evolution can account for purposive language, right? So for instance, the purpose of a heart is to pump blood. Well, what does that mean? It means that in the past, a heart that pumps blood has helped my ancestors survive. That's the purpose of my heart.
Right. So I guess kind of diving into more of the philosophical aspect. Now I do hear quite a bit of, arguments for atheism from, natural evil, from animal pain and suffering, like, how do we as theists, propose teleology in the light of things like, fawns needlessly dying in forest fires,
right?
Things like that. So would you want to go ahead and get into that?
Yeah, absolutely. So what is really interesting when it comes to these natural evils is how well I thought the ancient Christian tradition had already sort of looked ahead and given us answers for that. Okay. So I actually had a discussion with someone very recently about cancer. How do we account for cancer? Yeah. It's dysteleological, and dysteleological is a term that's thrown around. Is it doesn't seem to have a purpose, and I would actually strongly push back to that because I think that these evils, when you actually look at them from a closer perspective, they have to presuppose. It's very much like a moral argument. They have to presuppose the very order and purpose in order to even get off the ground. So, for instance, what is a cancer cell but a cell reacting in a way that's reproductive? It's reproducing itself. It's doing something that for the cell seems like a good, right? Yeah. It's doing something it's good for the cell, the individual cell. Now, why that's wrong is that sort of competes with the good of me. So for instance, if I were unfortunately to contract cancer, the goods of my own life and well-being would be impacted by the goods of these individual cells reproducing and trying to do their best for their own sort of individual purposes, right? So what you have here is you actually don't, when you talk about evils, you talk about these dysteleological, what you have is two clashing goods, and the greater good being outcompeted by a lesser good. Cells are supposed to function, get a function, teleology, have a purpose for the greater organism.
Right.
When that misaligns, that's whenever you get evils. It's when you don't have this higher order purpose being served. Instead, these lower order purposes are being served. And that's when you run these teleological arguments, you ultimately get to a point where you have to presuppose these lower order goods in order to say they're being outcompeting greater order goods. Now, that doesn't answer the question of why lower order goods outcompete greater order goods, but what it does do is it says, and even just to make this argument, you have to presuppose teleology, biological teleology. And so the argument actually, the very fact of this teleology is actually could be used as evidence for my case.
That's so interesting. So, would you say that there's sort of trade-offs? Because, when I hear like, cases of natural evil, it's like, hurricanes are devastating, but they also regulate precipitation. These earthquakes, help, minerals and everything that come up. And it's like, even like animal predation, we need predator to prey relationships for functioning ecosystems. So it seems to be like in order, or like almost like a fine tuning to that process. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, there's a scholar I'm good friends with. Her name's Bethany Solar-Redder. She's out at Oxford. She's done some fantastic work on this, especially some of her earlier work on has been absolutely phenomenal. So I recommend anyone who's wanting to delve into this to check out her work. But yeah, you've pointed out exactly right that most of these evil natural processes, earthquakes, tsunamis, et cetera, are natural outcomes of things that are good for the. What happens is when getting back to this, my lower order goods compete with theirs. So let's say I want to go suntanning on a beach, and a wave comes up. The tide comes in and drags me out to the ocean and drowns me. Then what happened is I was trying to actualize my own good, something good for me, some purpose or order that I was going toward. The ocean was doing what it's supposed to do, and those two clashed, right? And that's when you have, again, a clash of goods. So again, what we see here is exactly what you're pointing out. These are goods, and that's all you need to really show in order to defeat this argument, is what I'm proposing. At least defeat it as an argument for atheism, is to show that there is these competing goods, because these goods themselves presuppose, in a very sort of Platonic way, the good. The good itself, which is, for Plato, for Aristotle, for the classical Christian tradition, that's just another name for God. Now, we can talk about how you get from the good to God, but but as it stands right there, that's how the argument goes.
Yeah, it almost kind of reminds me of Brian Davies' work. He's done a lot of work on that. And so we know that with like predator to prey relationships, that the carnivores actually help the herbivores survive and thrive, and then likewise and everything. So I think that's so fascinating that we have such precision in a functioning ecosystem. It shows an intelligence and an intentionality that I think is really remarkable. And to kind of go off that, I was wondering what you think of how, like, what we would say the cosmic fine tuning, that you have to have all these perimeters for a life permitting universe. We have things like the universe forms hydrogen, helium, and tiny traces of lithium, beryllium, and boron. And then you get these other heavier elements that form in the furnace of stars over billions of years. That becomes a periodic table of elements. This expands, forming galaxies, rocky planets, and then you have the origin of life. And then once that microbial life starts growing, you also have the precision in the atmospheric conditions, the oxygen levels, degree of plate tectonics. So the way I see it, it's like you have all these different things that come together towards an end goal, and it's sort of like embodied moral agents. So what are your thoughts on that, on how it sort of all accumulates?
Yeah, then there's been increasing scholarship on this idea that for life to even evolve, it's not just that life needs to be fitted to the environment must be fitted to life. So there's a sort of
Right.
two-way fitness going on. And I get into fitness quite a bit, mostly from the direction of organism to environment, because I think that's
Mhm.
teleological. It's
Sure.
teleology all the way down.
Yeah.
But yeah, this argument, I mean, when it comes to it, I think what you're pointing out very, very clearly is for Aristotle, everything had a final cause. And for Plato, everything had a final cause, though he didn't use that language. Everything was oriented toward the good. And I think what we're seeing with Christians is a slow rediscovery, because it was Christians who ultimately did away with that system, and now atheists have jumped on board. What I see with all of this is a slow return back to the classical Christian tradition that recognized that everything is teleological, everything is directed in this intricate system towards an absolute good. And so that's where I think apologetics in the future, you're seeing this cumulative case nearly of a
Right.
teleological argument
Yeah.
is from physics down to, say, planetary systems, all the way through. And so I think this is building up slowly a cumulative case that I think provides a powerful argument for God's existence, and honestly a powerful worldview and an antidote to a lot of the
Yeah.
psychological feelings of purposelessness and depression that we feel today.
Oh, absolutely. I think that's such a good point. And yeah, it's like, we have and even as aesthetics, we have a beautifully ordered cosmos, and all things within that cosmos, we see all these processes harmonize and work together towards the ends and goals. And I think theism offers the best explanation of why there should be anything at all, and why, we should be in such an orderly, beautiful universe that it is geared and suited for bringing about life. So
Yeah.
yeah, I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, and I think it was Paul Dirac. Correct me if I'm wrong. I might be misattributing this quotation. Who said beauty was more a sign of the truth than correspondence with the empirical evidence. And he's talking about physical theories.
Right.
Whether that's an exaggeration or not, what it does reveal is of the very ancient Christian idea that beauty, truth, and goodness were all one and the same.
Yeah, that's so amazing. I really like that. So who would you recommend for people in the audience that want to really look into this argument more? What are some recommendations you would have with that regard?
Yeah. There's quite a few. There's good ones. There's Alex Proust did a series of lectures recently at the University of Oxford on natural theology. He delves into this argument. Also, Rob Koons. If you type in just Rob Koons, the great philosopher, just type in biology and teleology, you'll get a good lecture on that. Although I don't agree with everything he says in the lecture, it is a good lecture. And I think that's an easy entrance. He also has a book, Realism Regained, which is good.
I have that book. I've been meaning to start on that. Yeah,
it's a difficult one, but it's a great one. Let's see. Plantinga actually touches on this in Warrant and Proper Function when he talks about proper functionality, as I quote in my article. Other people, Mark Ockrent would be another one. He has a book called Nature and Normativity. It's not a theistic book, but it does argue for the reality of biological teleology. And so I think that's a good starting point, because that's sort of premise one of the argument. So Mark Ockrent would be the one book that I'd recommend.
Yeah, and another thing I was just thinking of is, and Faz Rana from Reasons to Believe brings this up a lot, and I think it's a really interesting point as far as the history of life on the planet's surface, because it seems like we have this microbial life that paves the way in very unique ways for more advanced life. And you even look at the epochs in history, like the Triassic and the Jurassic. It lays down these biodeposits that we use to make a high-tech global civilization, and can make morally relevant decisions with the biodeposits that have built up over the last 3.8 billion years, which I think is really interesting. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it is an interesting argument. I'm not sure what sort of evidential value you could give that for theism, because how much, how do you know when something is fortuitous versus when something is designed for a purpose? That's why I think when you get to sort of logical necessity arguments like my argument, or ones where you can actually put numerical values to, that's when the apologetic value really sort of begins to take off, is because then you can actually see it's necessary, in the case of my argument, it's necessary for some grounding in an ultimate good. in order for biology to even be a real scientific field. Or you have, say, the fine-tuning argument. I think there's apologetic value to that, just for the simple sake of we love quantitative measures, and we can actually put numbers to it, right? And so those are interesting arguments, and I think from a Christian perspective, you could see that. Mm-hmm. As far as the apologetic value of it, I think it loses a teeny bit simply because not saying that he shouldn't be doing this, so I don't want to be misheard there. But I do think the reason why these arguments haven't picked up in strength is because it's difficult. You can't actually pinpoint when something is just a fortuitous accident rather than
as opposed to being more intentional.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I think from a Christian theological perspective, as C.S. Lewis once said, I believe in Christianity not just because I believe in the sun, not just because I see it, but by it I see everything else. That it gives you a lens for understanding this as not just fortuitous.
Right.
And so there is a bit of a value in that capacity, and I think that's the thing that I think that's when apologetics is actually at its best, is whenever it provides a lens through which to interpret reality in a way that is most meaningful, beautiful, and corresponds to the way they see it.
Absolutely. And I'm curious, that kind of brings up an interesting question. Do you see any relevance to moral agency in the biological processes and the teleology within biology? Would you say it's geared towards moral agency or moral agents?
Yeah, and there's a lot of good work from she just recently retired, Sarah Coakley, out of Cambridge. She's done a lot of good work on game theory and how evolutionary theory sort of is a virtue crafting machine in a sense. And I would agree with that. But even from a more broad scale, the tradition I'm working in actually has a long tradition really within the field of ethics. So I think you pinpoint a really good point there, which is natural law theory, which is the idea, basically that things have ends, natural ends. And and to be a good human being is to fulfill those ends. In the same way that to be a good fisherman means that I have a good rod, it entails certain prescriptions on me, that I go fishing at the right time, that I do X, do Y, do Z. In the same way, to be a good human being entails that I fulfill certain functions that are natural to what it means to be a human being. So in very similar way, that's all goodness means for them. But I think it's a very simple, ancient idea of what goodness means. I actually find that a very powerful moral case.
Right. So what do you think of The Fifth Way by Aquinas? That's one of my...
Fifth Way is great.
I love it.
Yeah, so Fifth Way, unfortunately, the Fifth Way, when Aquinas talks about the Fifth Way, that's actually the Summa, let's point the right direction, the Summa right behind me, is actually one of his shortest versions. He actually gives the argument in multiple places throughout his works. And what we have is quite often a misunderstood. As much as I love the Dominican brothers, they mistranslated that section. So I actually am a huge fan of the Fifth Way. It will make its way into the final product. But a Fifth Way, nice. The Fifth Way a Fifth Way that's actually fleshed out far more than I think most treatments of it have been, because I think it's unfortunately misinterpreted. Because Aquinas is making a pretty much identical argument to what I am, though in obviously a very shortened form. And he's focusing on the universe writ large. It was sort of an accepted fact that things tended towards their own good back in the day, whether they were living or non-living. Today, to make that case, you only see that in biology, because like I was pointing out with like Bacon and Descartes and Mersenne, and there's a few other figures. Science doesn't do with purposes outside of biology. So I'm trying, in a sense, you could actually, I think that you picked up on something real key. You could actually see mine as an updated version of Aquinas' Fifth Way, specifically for contemporary context.
Right. Yeah, that's what I was thinking. And, especially with this, these processes, that aren't intelligent in themselves being guided by intelligence, intentionality, which I think is really interesting. But I also like Swinburne's argument, and I kind of wanted to get your take on that, because he'll say something like, if God exists, it would be moderately probable that he would create human beings and so human bodies. The laws of nature would have to be, specifically fine-tuned if they are to bring about the existence of human bodies. So the evidence of the existence of human bodies adds to the probability of theism over naturalism. And in other words, we should kind of expect these laws and processes to be geared towards developing human bodies or embodied moral agency, I guess, if you want to take it a little further. What are your thoughts on the work Swinburne's done with this?
Yeah, Swinburne is what I do appreciate about Swinburne, though I work sort of on the border between analytic and non-analytic philosophy. Swinburne is just classical analytic, and
Yeah.
when it comes to it, I mean, despite some of my critiques of analytic philosophy writ large, I do think, like, for somebody who is analytically inclined, his arguments are fantastic. They're probably at top notch along with Plantinga's. Of if someone who literally, let's take the method, the very narrow method given to us within analytic philosophy,
Sure.
let's run with it, and you still sort of arrive at a natural theology, right? Because yeah, I mean, if we're just going to talk about like you, I think you've very well summarized this point. If you're just going to talk about the existence of embodied moral agents, human agents like us,
Mhm.
that on its own, is that more probable on theism or atheism? You know, those are interesting. I always find those as interesting arguments, especially, again, I feel like a broken record, getting back to a very quantitative sort of mindset is when we're dealing with probabilities, and when we actually deal with probabilities. I actually have a criticism of how we deal with it,
Oh,
but
okay.
yeah, unfortunately, I think a lot of how you see probabilities are dealt with today is that we do so intuitively. It just seems more probable to me. And that might more so reflect our current cultural circumstance, the current ways we think, the current ways we were taught, more than it actually reflects anything ontological. There's no way to sort of separate those two out.
That's interesting.
Have you heard of the incredulous stare?
No, I have not.
So in analytic philosophy, it's sort of a joke. But it's not as well which is it's this idea that in analytic philosophy, it counts as a refutation if a very well trained, intelligent person intelligent philosopher has looked at your arguments, tried very much to understand it, and they come away not understanding it. That acts as a refutation. And it's
Oh,
also
not
sometimes
yeah, yeah.
jokingly called the incredulous stare. Like when you get that
Right.
stare, that's not originally how it was used, but that's how I've seen it more increasingly being used.
Right.
And again, that actually does take, like I see a lot of analytic philosophers say, I find it implausible that. So I find it implausible that
Sure.
I'm helping someone an analytic philosopher, a Hindu, and
Oh, nice.
he does it quite a few times where he says, we find it implausible that X, Y, and Z, and gives reasons for it.
Hmm.
Um, but I mean, that's typical analytic philosophy, and I find that
Yeah.
I'm a little critical of that because it doesn't account for its own history. The fact that the reason most analytic philosophers are skeptical of final causation is purely historical. That we are children of Descartes. It's not a fact. If had they been born 500 years ago, they would have found it implausible that it wasn't.
Hmm.
So we are shaped by our history and we're shaped by our tradition in a way that I'm actually quite happy to see that a lot of analytic philosophers are coming to understand.
Yeah, that's true. But I also I think there's a lot of value in really like being clarifying positions, analyzing it, being clear, methodological.
Mhm.
I do think it's a good way to understand nature and ultimate reality. Also.
Yeah. So I've swung one way. Let me swing back.
Okay.
So yeah, because I do feel like I've been a little critical. So analytic
Yeah.
philosophy, I've compared it to a hammer. Hammers are
Mhm.
great; they're a wonderful tool, but you can't build a house with a hammer. You need material, you need nails, you need all these other things. Analytic philosophy as a method is
Right.
good for shaping. It's good for perhaps a saw would be better. Let's go with a saw because it's good for shaping. It's good for cutting away the excess, and it's good for shaping the material you already have. But it always exists within a certain tradition, certain beliefs, certain things that we find plausible or implausible,
Right.
and those are extra. Those are outside of analytic philosophy and outside the method. So I actually would agree. I do think that clarity and those sorts of things can be helpful quite a bit. The
Hmm.
problem is when we mistake the method for an ontology, and I think
Ah.
that's where we get into danger. Because if you actually read the Scholastics,
Mhm.
Duns Scotus especially, the clarity and rigor that they practiced is unparalleled by anyone within the philosophical tradition outside of what I think are the analytics. So it's not as
Mhm.
if the analytics, are on their own in that capacity. In a lot of ways, they were reacting to German idealism, who were
Mhm.
very
Yeah.
unclear and next
Yeah.
to impossible to read. What I do see is that the scholastics were more aware of the tradition they were working out of, and that's where I'm seeing analytic philosophy is moving toward. The classic example I give is Alistair McIntyre.
Yeah.
William Wood would be another one out of Oxford, who's very aware of the integrating the tradition. And that's something that I'm really hopeful for analytic philosophy, is bringing in that critical, that hammer, sorry, I changed it to a saw, didn't I?
The saw,
Bringing that saw into a greater tradition and being critical and self-reflective on the beliefs that we bring to.
Yeah, absolutely. And before I forget, our good friend Zachary Arden had a question he wanted me to ask you.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is from Zachary. He says, "Well, I think that evolution is inherently irreducibly teleological. Where does a Dennett type picture of evolution go wrong in principle?"
Yeah, where to begin on that? So Zachary is a biologist, and I know he's a friend.
And we're hoping to have him come on as well. So.
Yeah, he fantastic. If you do, one of the smartest guys I know. So why is evolution inherently and irreducibly teleological, right? So there's many different ways we could come at this. Now, one, I would say biological organisms are, because what makes something what it is its goal, its teleology, right? So if the definition I used to, when I've given talks on this, I give up the standard definition of what makes a planet, right? It's cleared out its orbit. Pluto doesn't qualify, but Uranus does, right? Earth does. So there's a very clear physical definition. Now, let me ask you, what makes a heart a heart?
That to pump blood to give life.
Yeah. It's defined by its purpose, right? My heart is very different from a two-chambered. It's four-chambered. Mine's very different from a very tiny two-chambered fish heart.
Right.
It's very different from a three-chambered amphibian heart, and it's obviously leagues away from an artificial heart. But they all are hearts, not because of anything physical about them. If we got an alien heart, it would still be a heart, even if it was completely different. It's what makes it a heart is its function. So biology itself, and you could do this with any trait. Biology itself presupposes that its very identity is built on teleology. Now that's biology. Now what about evolution, right? So I'm going to foreground. This is a bit of if you're okay with it, it's going to be a bit of an extended argument, if that's okay.
Sure. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Absolutely, bro.
So, and this gets into the idea of natural selection, right? Natural selection, how we normally think about that is nature selecting. It's a complex argument. Slow me down if I get in, right? So there's a thing, obviously, you'll know about in analytic philosophy, causal arrows, right?
Yes.
X to Y, right? X causes Y. The arrow goes from one to the other. So how should we think of natural selection, right? Is natural selection, is the causal arrow going from environment to creature, or is it going from creature to environment? And we could have any combination of this, but that's really the two agents being, the two agents in question, right? Mm-hmm. Environment and creature. So where is the primary causal arrow? Where do we want to sort of ground that in? Well, I think there's an analytic philosopher, Jerry Fodor, and he wrote a book quite recently, What Darwin Got Wrong, and where he comes out against Darwinism because he views the causal arrow going from environment to creature. Most people have misinterpreted the book, but this is his primary argument, is that if the causal arrow of Darwinism goes from environment to creature, well, the environment selects whole creatures, right? It doesn't just select individual traits.
Right.
So as he points out, the environment doesn't select, because it doesn't select individual traits, it doesn't distinguish between those things that it's selecting for and those things that are just sort of tagging along, right? So if that's the way we view natural selection, there's no way to differentiate between what's selected for and what Stephen Jay Gould called spandrels, things that sort of hang along. So for instance, to give a clear example, my heart pumps blood, but it also makes a thump noise. Mm-hmm. The environment has chosen my heart, for both. But very clearly, we know that the reason I'm alive, the reason the heart was selected is because it pumps blood. So it cannot be, despite its name, it cannot be that nature is selecting, the environment is selecting the creature, because it selects both. But we very clearly know that the cause, and a few of his critics have pointed this out, is that the cause actually is going from creature to environment. It's my heart doing some good that then I go out into the environment and I'll compete other creatures. So immediately, terminologically, natural selection seems a little confused. It's not necessarily nature select. I'm selecting myself in a sense through nature. So it's a causal error of me going into the environment, right? Me interacting with my environment. And I think that's a better way to view it. So yeah, that deals with it. But then there's a problem, right, with natural selection, which is the fact that, so if it's my traits that go out into the environment and cause my own selection, well, then there's an interesting thing. There's this what's called the statistical model of natural selection, which has gained in popularity recently. And they've pointed out that there's a big problem with this view as well. Now, do you know the difference between natural selection and genetic drift, or should I define that? Should I define it for the audience?
Yeah, probably for the audience.
Okay. So for natural selection, when we think of natural selection is big, strong creature A. This is way overly simplified. Big, strong creature A outcompetes, puny creature B, right? So that's what we think of natural selection. Well, genetic drift is thrown in as a sort of other force, a competing force, which is sort of randomness. So say big, strong creature A accidentally gets struck by lightning.
Right.
And puny creature B survives and reproduces in its genes that go into the environment, right? That's called genetic drift. So it's sort of a name given for randomness, whereas natural selection is the sort of big mover and shaker of the fittest creatures surviving. Well, what the statistical interpretation likes to point out is that when you actually try to differentiate themselves, let's say creature A has a 75% chance of survival and creature B has a 25% chance of survival. Well, it's not a different force acting in each case, right? If I say I have a 25% chance of flipping heads twice, if I flip heads twice, I don't say some external force has come in and overridden natural selection.
Right.
So the statistical interpretation say genetic drift, even when the puny creature survives, that's just as much a case of natural selection, even though it's unlikely. That's just the same thing. So immediately that problematizes. So we saw natural selection is a problem when the causal arrow going from environment to creature. But they point out it's also a problem going from creature to environment because it can't differentiate from randomness and genetic drift. So they've made the provocative statement that natural selection only exists within the notebook of scientists. It just maps our expectations of what's going to happen. It's not a real thing out in the world. And so that's a problem too, because natural selection is supposed to be a mechanism. It's supposed to, it's been compared to a Newtonian mechanism. Elliot Soberg, one of the best philosophers and biologists, compares it to that. But it can't be if it's this internal going from creature to the environment. It can't be that. It can't be a mechanism, a force distinct from a force distinct from genetic drift. So either way, you have a problem, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So either way, because that's the only two ways you could do it. And if you started to try and combine them back and forth, maybe it's environment to creature to environment, you just multiply the problems. You don't do away with them.
Right.
Yeah, you just add these problems together because the inherent problems don't disappear by making the causal arrow more complicated.
Yeah, that's kind of like why I was thinking about, the role that the precision in the environment, the constraints it places on the biological process also, because, there are hundreds of features. Like we need the right amount of heat in the Earth's crust, the volcanic activity, plate tectonics, the oxygenation events, and all these local conditions that also kind of put these strains and kind of move the process along, or have to be within very narrow perimeters. That kind of gets into the work of Burrow and Tipler, and how all these processes that have to be in place for biology to even take off. So
Barrow and Tipler are good on that. But just to kind of close that out, lest anyone think that I'm a critic of natural selection, I'm trying to save natural selection, honestly, because I recognize this as a major issue. And honestly, it has been recognized. The best definition I found of fitness, which we're talking about fitness, right, is fitness. It was actually in a dictionary for biological terms. It said fitness, a term every biologist understands, but no one can define. And that's exactly the problem we're in, is fitness seems to be the sort of causal thing. This creature A has a greater fitness than creature B. Its fitness is the cause going out into the environment that's doing it. And ultimately, what I'm going to argue is that what biologists are doing is they're smuggling in a concept of a form, a Platonic form, and that these certain functions, it has a higher fitness when this form aligns with the environment better than these other creatures. Its perfections, using this Thomistic language, its perfections align with a sort of natural habitat better than this other creature. And this can account for when you add in, and again, this is qualitative, this isn't quantitative. So it's different. This is different from what most analytic philosophers are trying to do. Nevertheless, I think it's smuggled in. And that's the intuition that we're having when we say, no, that's not natural selection. That 25% chance when the creature B survives, that's not, because creature A is better. It's more fit. It's got its form aligned with the environment better. But there's the problem of immediately we're back to Aristotle. Immediately we're back to teleology, a real teleology, that these things have purposes, that creatures whose traits serve their functions better, serve their ends, their purposes better, are more fit in their natural habitat. And that's when you start to say, how do you deal with that on an atheistic, mechanistic, materialistic paradigm?
Right.
That's a huge issue.
Yeah, that kind of and we have a question in the audience wanting clarification, but just real quick, do you think that would play any role in like junk DNA having useful purposes? Would you see that as being involved in teleology whatsoever? That what we thought was junk DNA left over from a common ancestor is actually useful and helps us. How does what role does that play in anything, or does it play any role?
Yeah, I think the very question itself presupposes it, right? So for instance, how I've seen it posed is it useless? Well, then how do you account for it? Well, there's this idea that viruses have come along and attached the genetic material, right? These viruses have their own purposes they're fulfilling, right? So it's this lower level teleology, or is there a higher level organism teleology that these things serve? So the question of junk DNA, I think it's really fascinating. But at the end of the day, whatever answer you come to, you're going to end up right back at the same spot, I think, which is that
you have to presuppose it to
either way.
Even ask it, like you were saying.
Yeah. Either way, you're sort of trapped in this. You're trapped in using teleological terms to account for it.
Right. That's so interesting. Okay, so we did have a question. Just for clarification, wouldn't natural selection not be a creative force, but a selective one of pre-existing information?
Yeah, and that's exactly, and I 100% assume that. Although I will say there is questions within philosophy about, I don't get into that, and I don't really try to take a stance on that, whether or not we can view natural selection as itself creative. I don't really want to deal with that. That's a little sort of a side topic in philosophy of biology. It's great literature for Hosanna. Hosanna, if you want to get into that, that is real interesting literature, probably more interesting than what I'm doing. But yeah, so what I'm doing is I'm saying nature, let's take the first example of nature selecting the creature, right? The causal error going from environment to creature, right? It's selecting the entire creature. It didn't create the creature, it's selecting it, right? Exactly. But also in the other way, the causal error going from creature to environment, it's the creature's already existing traits that cause it to outcompete, to have higher fitness and outcompete other creatures. So in both cases, I'm actually taking the more restrained, restrictive view that natural selection is not creative. It's merely selective. So yes.
And he did also ask, what is defined as natural selection in this dialogue?
Yeah. So natural selection is this idea of you need oh gosh, I'm spacing because Richard Lewontin gives a great definition of this, and I'm trying off the top of my head to recall it. So check out Richard Lewontin's definition of it. But basically what he says is you need a population, you need selection pressures, and then you need levels of fitness, essentially. I believe those are the three factors. So you need a population of creatures, there needs to be some sort of pressure, there needs to be some sort of like constraints, right? That it's got to be there. But then you got to imagine which way the causal arrow goes, but we got into that, right? And then you got to imagine levels of fitness. And that's that third element, that fitness element that I'm really getting into is questioning, because that's a necessary, it's sort of it's been seen as a sort of three-legged stool, right? Unless you have all three legs, the stool doesn't stand. It's that third one that I'm trying to preserve.
Oh yeah, and Spartan Theology, our good friend Ethan Birkin says hello. So what's up, Ethan? So I think this is really fascinating stuff, and I think it's a really important argument. So what importance or significance would you think that this teleological argument has for Christian theism as a whole?
Yeah. So
even the philosophy of religion in general, because this seems to be like a really underrated argument that I would really like to see pushed out there more.
Yeah, I think, well, I'll give you multiple things because a lot of things are coming to mind. From a science and religion perspective, I think it allows really one of the first times that theology is able to talk back to science and basically say,
Yeah.
hey, you're presupposing a certain theology. And in one case, you're trying to hold a mechanistic, sort of voluntaristic view of God. And that's in Hanby's book quite a bit. I leave that argument to him. And I think he's argued it quite persuasively. He calls it theological extrinsicism. You have this view of God, yet at the same time, the very science you're doing is presupposing a more classical, theological intrinsic view of God. And that's the sort of like, that's actually a real critique, a theological critique of the field of biology. And I think that's actually a productive conversation biology and theology should be having, is this two-way interface. Whereas, before it's usually like, how do we fit the historical Adam with evolutionary science or something like that?
Right,
It's science doing all the talking and theology doing all the compromising to try and fit it in, right?
Sure. Yeah.
So I think in that capacity, it's good. I think theologically, I think it allows us to see how God works in evolution. We had a bit of a conversation about, how do we fit theology, or how do we fit evolution into a Christian theology?
Exactly.
Well, my argument would make sense of evolution is the very capacity of creation to be basically, for God to work in. It's a view of divine causation that's quite eminent, very eminent, more eminent than even the intelligent design theorists have it. And yet at the same time, it's completely, it's more in line with the scientific views, I'd argue, than sort of an atheistic materialism, Darwinian evolution view would be. So I think that's actually a fantastic, apologetically, theologically views of divine causation. I think that's going to be quite productive. And I mean, the list can keep going on and on. I think this is I think this is the future. I think the teleological argument should see as complementary to the already existing approaches, which have so many defenders, and I'm grateful that they do. But this feels like an untouched area that I think theologians really ought to start signing on to.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And I think it makes a good abductive case. Because, in scientific reasoning, we'll look at theories like what's simple, but yet going to unify and harmonize, multiple data points. What has the explanatory power and the scope, the coherential virtues, what goes off what we already have as warranted beliefs. And I think theism, being a simple hypothesis, really fits well. So we could say that, perhaps the best explanation of what apparent teleology and biology is that there's an intelligence and intentionality behind the process.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, I would agree. I would see this as a very, I might see this, you might see this as a way, as a bridge between people who have completely, taken out teleology from biology. There's a lot of Christians who are reluctant to even to make such descriptions purely from a scientific mentality. Yeah. And those who, who are, on board with, say, creationism or intelligent design. And I know you work for RTV. I love Hugh Ross. I've met him. He's a great guy. But for people like even, I mean, it works even for an intelligent design perspective. I just focus on evolution. Because, like I said, it works for life writ large. It's teleological. But it does provide, I think, a middle path of being able to affirm a very immanent God who's creative, who's working in creation, and yet someone who can fully subscribe to Darwinian without fear that it somehow makes the intrinsic probability of Christian theism less probable and makes it more probable, is my argument. So it undercuts that atheist. Dawkins said that Darwin enabled someone to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist, and my whole point is saying not so fast.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think that's kind of helpful. I think that will hopefully be a helpful offering for Christian theology and apologetics.
Yeah, and reasons to believe they have many different views. I've talked with Fazali Rana, and he's very sympathetic to process structuralism. And so, in a way, they would sort of see, like, you have this process structuralism, and then perhaps God de novo creates things like the origin of life, eukaryotic cells, the body structures and everything. So, while I lean closer towards evolutionary creationism, I do see some overlap sort of in some of the old Earth creation, evolutionary creationism.
Yeah. And what's interesting is, while I approach it differently, the idea of people, like Stephen Meyer, who I've recently did a show with.
Oh, yeah.
Stephen Meyer, he tries to read out of biological I don't want to say biological complexity. He tries to read out of the DNA information systems that the hints of an intelligent design. Well, if my case is true, then life sort of is built into the cosmos, essentially. I
Right.
mean, to use a sort of rough analogy, it's sort of built into the cosmos because God acts as a teleological end towards which everything is striving, especially life forms are striving.
Yeah.
That's getting real into the roots that I haven't really talked about yet,
Right.
but it would actually account for everything that Stephen Meyer's pointing out
I like.
theologically, like he likes, but also it doesn't have to do away with Darwinian evolution.
Yeah. So, would you say it could, this teleology and biology, like, your work is really emphasizing, could it provide sort of a bridge between, the theistic evolution, ID, old Earth proponents?
I hope so. That would actually be another. That is so. I've actually presented this. There's a conference, the American Scientific Affiliation. Despite its name, it's a Christian. It's a firmly
Right.
Christian organization with most of the scientists. And I presented this. There's some intelligent design theorists there, and quite a few uh, evolutionary biologists who obviously believe in evolution. And so that's been a point of contention. And I actually presented this as a mediating position for everyone. It went over well, I think. I hope so. But that is, yeah, you point that out, and that's actually been one of the ways I've posed this. Is I hope
Oh,
I do hope that this can be a mediating point where intelligent design theorists can get what they want, which is they want to see God working within it. They see God in
right.
the biological systems, and I don't deny that. I have a hard time denying that. But at the same time, there's also these things like evidences for common descent and all these other things that these other
Right.
biologists are like, how do you deal with that? And I see this as a mediating position.
Yeah, that's so cool. So you and I talk about so much stuff. I didn't know you actually worked on that. Because that's something that's really important to myself is kind of bridging the gap between these two positions, and that's something that I myself am really working towards. That's kind of like I was saying with something like the environmental the fine tuning or
Mhm.
precision in the environmental constraints, like kind of sort of like laying down tracks, like if the biological process is like a train that these precision in the conditions sort of lay down the tracks that life needs to go. So I've kind of seen that as a way both parties can kind of get what they want, maybe more so with one than the other. But
Yeah.
yeah, I really like that.
Have you checked out Zachary Ardern's and Rope's video on capturing Christianity yet?
I haven't. He's told me about that, and I need to.
Yeah, I've posed this in one of Cameron's videos. I posed this as a complementary argument to me because I think we're sort of on the same wavelength of wanting exactly that, as seeing
Yeah,
the goods of intelligent design theory
right.
while recognizing the value of evolutionary theory as, I mean, a true scientific theory.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of that, our good friend Hosanna has some more questions.
Perfect.
He wanted to know when using the term evolution, is it defined on a macro or micro scale? I know what you're going to say, but I'll let you say it.
Yeah, both, honestly. Those distinctions that you do find them in some evolutionary biologist literature, they've mostly been picked up by creationists because it's really tough to define the line. So, for instance, would you say a speciation event is a instance of macroevolution? Well, Ken Ham believes that creatures differentiate
Mhm.
between different species.
Yeah,
It's they've got their own science called baraminology to try to differentiate between macro and
oh,
microevolution, but that's
right.
that's obviously not something. Macro micro is virtually not used within the scientific community, so I don't differentiate between the two. If you believe in either, I think
Right.
you have to assume this, but I don't make those differentiations.
All right. And he follows up again. Um, if it is defined on a macro scale, wouldn't it be contradictory to with the Genesis narrative uses the word kind?
Yeah, Barrowman. Yeah.
Yeah.
So this gets into interpretation, of which I am not a
Yes.
biblical scholar, but I will
Right.
say, that I do think, and Alex Bruce has made this argument as well, that there
Mhm.
needs to be formal changes. And what I mean by that is there's got to be a point where, say, what's a good example? A fish evolving into an amphibian, or so, or
Right.
an ape evolving into a man. There's got to be a point where the ape is no longer an ape; it is a man, and not within the lifetime. I mean, the species. There's going to be creatures that we call, one is a human, that's hominid, and one
Mhm.
is not, say Australopithecine or something like that. Right? There's got to be these formal changes. So if we grant the reality of forms, which I'm saying we have to in biology, because even the concept of species, I think, presupposes that. I don't buy into Ernst Mayer's definition of species for anyone who's in the know on that niche, that topic. If we buy into the reality of forms, then we have to account for formal changes when one creature becomes another creature along this evolutionary process.
Right.
So my point, so I actually do think that that God is creating through the evolutionary process by being the generator of these forms, that these creatures newly participate within the goodness of God by participating in a different formal structure than they did before. So that's actually, that's my point of God is creating through evolution. There are exact points you could say God created that creature, even though evolutionarily it'll look like a seamless stream, kind of like from day to night. God made day and night, but it's the existence of twilight doesn't make me doubt that. In the same way, evolution, there can be from, say, Australopithecines to hominid, and it can look like a seamless stream, and yet there be a point where God makes that formal change and designates and says, this is a human, and there is that formal structural change. And Augsburg makes that distinction. So I would agree. You could still read Genesis. Creatures do reproduce according to their kind, except on those places where God specially creates. It would that naturally creatures do that, and that's all that Genesis narrative is trying to communicate, is that creatures reproduce according to their kind, unless of divine intervention, of course, right?
Right. Yeah, and I'll just say on that briefly that so you have Hebrew scholars like Michael Heiser, for example. He'll point out that the literary genre of the ancient Near East at the time this is written, it's much different than we would sort of think of it with our modern Western understanding. And he'll point out that if you look at the Mesopotamian, Egyptian, and these different pagan deities that the Israelites were surrounded with, well, their gods had certain ways, and they had creation narratives. And so a lot of Genesis functions as a polemic to say, no, it's not the Egyptian sun god who makes the sun. Yahweh created the great light. You'll notice it's called great light to reduce, because in a lot of the other cultures surrounding them, it was a deity. And so this reduces it to just an element under the dominion of Yahweh. And, so there's interwoven in that. It's an ancient Near Eastern polemic to sort of the pagan deities surrounding the Israelites. And then you have somebody like John Walton, who will say that it's not about the material creation as much as it's about function, that God's ordering the function of his cosmic temple. And what's interesting is even, reasons to believe. We take sort of a combination of the ancient Near East with a literal reading from sort of a day age perspective. But even the animals on the day age perspective, it's reduced. You'll notice it's silent on reptiles. You have, marine life. Then you have rodents or crawling, creeping things. Then you'll notice the animals are what are like regulated for, human civilization, like, wild beasts, domesticated animals. And so it's very narrow. And then finally, I don't mean to rant, but finally, the last thing is, the ancient Hebrews had a different way of classifying things than we do. For example, what they would call birds were just anything with wings. It could be insects, it could be birds, anything that a bat. And it's not that they're wrong; it's just the way they classified things, for that time.
They didn't have a Linnaean classification system, yeah.
I mean, and so it's right, because a bird was just anything with with wings. So in that sense, yeah, a bat's a bird according to their.
It just doesn't translate well.
Right.
Yeah. I will. I just wanted to throw in. Yeah, I firmly back up Heiser. Walton, I think, is mostly correct. I think he does. I've actually gotten an argument with him about this. Is I think he overemphasizes final causation to the expense of the other three.
I think so too.
Yeah. Causes. Yeah, because there is a point where you ask, so what did happen during the 6 days of creation? If you were standing there, nothing. Right. And I don't think that's the way they would have interpreted that.
Right. I think it's hard to deny at least some material causality.
Right. Yeah.
So I'm skeptical of that myself.
And I do value Heiser's emphasis on genre. I will also back up what you're saying and saying, I don't know of any Old Testament scholar today who would disagree. At least I can't think of one from my conversations and who I've met who would disagree with the idea that Genesis was not written in the style in the style that you see young Earth creationists interpreting it. It was written in the style of a polemic against the other creation narratives on account there.
Right.
It has to be interpreted as subversive of their accounts
Yeah,
for that
and
exact reason.
a lot of people don't realize this, and they sort of mislabel reasons to believe. Reasons to believe itself is in the courses we take. It really emphasizes the ancient Near East, that it is a polemic. They just say, well, hey, look, what's being described on these particular days, it just so happens to align with what we know in the early sciences. So I think it's pretty much, across the board, the majority of scholars are going to say Genesis, like at its most basic root, is an ancient Near Eastern polemic, to the pagan deities, and I think that's pretty powerful. It's true. It's true, and what it affirms, it's true that it's not these pagan gods that create the sun or order out of chaos. It's Yahweh, who is the one true God.
Mm-hmm.
We're made in His image and are to rule the earth as His image bearers. And so I think Genesis is correct in what it affirms or is trying to affirm.
Yeah, and it actually makes sense of things that don't seem to make sense otherwise. Right. So, for instance, it paints God as sort of limited in knowledge, walking through a field and discovering things and stuff like that.
Right.
Breathing in as if God has a respiratory system.
Right.
And there's a lot of the ways, and you have to understand. Not even young Earth creationists take that literally. That God wasn't literally surprised, or but it also accounts for certain things like, and then God created the great Tenyin, which is the Hebrew word, and we usually translate that as like the great whales or the great beasts of the sea or something like that. Well, he already said he created that. Why does he say that? Well, if you understand that these were gods of chaos, right?
Right.
And these ancient pagan, what he's saying, it's not just saying God created whales. It's saying God is the God of chaos. Even in chaos and the turmoil, God is creating order. God has an order and a purpose for that. So there's this richer account that you just don't get if you take these as in a sort of modern contemporary sense. You lose what it's actually communicating at a greater level and a deeper level.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember at RTB when we're studying this that a lot of the Egyptian gods would create out of the watery chaos called Nun. They would come out and they would form order out of the chaos. And so when you understand that background, you realize that Genesis 1:2 is saying, no, it's not the Egyptian God, it's Yahweh who can create order out of chaos, because you have that formless and void language. And so I think you're spot on there, that it's so much more rich,
I've actually heard Ken Ham talk about that passage. You know what he thinks of it?
Oh, no.
He says, well, I think these are like plesiosaurs and mosasaurs, like the watery reptiles. And then he's like, and he uses that as a case for that these ancient scholars knowing about these creatures. And I'm just like, yeah.
That's one of those cringe moments there.
Yeah. Not to make fun of young Earth creationists. I just, my point is that there's a richer meaning there that if you don't understand the context, that you miss.
Absolutely. And I don't want to, because we've already passed the hour mark, but there's one thing. In fact, I did a debate with a young Earth creationist a few months ago, and Ethan, Spartan Theology, and I were talking about this. That you'll notice the similarities in the Genesis account with these other ancient Near Eastern accounts. But what's even more interesting are the differences. So instead of being slaves to the gods who go about who are created just to please their whims and do the heavy labor and manual and everything, you'll notice in the Genesis account we're made in God's image and are to rule the earth as His image bearers and are given dignity and so just to kind of touch on what you're saying, there's so much more a richer meaning we get when we understand the background and everything. And so I would just say that Genesis is correct in what it affirms.
Yeah, I'm in 100% agreement with that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, wow, I think this has been a super interesting discussion. This is a topic not so much about biology, but teleology, Genesis, the fine-tuning, things like that. It's something that I happen to be really interested in, and so I thought it was a really good talk. Is there anything you want to leave the audience with before we head out?
No, other than just say, if you're curious about this topic, Seth P. Hart at outlook.com. Sorry, it is an Outlook email. That's all it was available. And I get a lot of teasing for that. And check out, I'm a regular contributor to Capturing Christianity, the main site. So check out for the blog posts that I have so far and for future ones. So thanks again, Travis.
All right. So with that, I guess we're going to go ahead and sign out. Take care and God bless everyone.